For 3 years, Graham Mercer believed he was living inside a marriage poisoned by suspicion. Every late meeting, every unanswered text, every exhausted silence became evidence in his wife's eyes. She searched his pockets, checked his phone while he slept, asked questions with a smile sharp enough to cut skin. At first he thought it was insecurity, then he thought it was jealousy. Eventually he started wondering if maybe she was right. Because when someone accuses you long enough with enough certainty, you begin to question the shape of your own innocence. But the truth waiting beneath their marriage was far more disturbing than infidelity. His wife wasn't trying to catch a cheater. She was trying to create one. Chicago in November looked like a city permanently recovering from bad news. The sidewalks glistened with old rain. Wind tunneled between steel towers hard enough to force people into themselves. Everyone walked quickly, collars raised, eyes lowered, as if intimacy itself had become inefficient. From the 32nd floor of the Mercer and Vale Architectural Office, Mercer watched snow threaten the skyline without fully committing. Much like his marriage. "You're distracted again," the voice came from behind him. Soft, elegant, practiced. Graham turned from the window. Vanessa stood near his office door, wearing a charcoal wool coat over a cream turtleneck, her dark hair pinned loosely behind one ear. To anyone else, she looked like the kind of woman magazines described as effortlessly composed. To Graham, she looked tired. Not physically. Strategically. "I'm listening," he said. "No, you're pretending to." She closed the door quietly behind her. Not angry. Vanessa almost never raised her voice anymore. Early in their marriage, arguments had burned hot and loud. Over time, they had evolved into something colder. Precision strikes disguised as conversation. "I asked what time you got home last night." 10:30. "You said 11 before." Graham exhaled slowly. "I rounded." Vanessa studied him for several seconds, too long. It was one of the things he had started noticing in recent years. The silence after answers, as if she wasn't listening to what he said, but measuring whether it matched some internal script she already possessed. "You smell different," she said finally. There it was, always something. Different cologne, different mood, different tone in a text message, different pause before answering. At first, Graham had defended himself passionately, then logically, then patiently. Now he mostly felt tired. "I was at the Lexington site all evening," he replied. "You know that. With who? The project team. Which people?" He looked at her carefully. "You already know the names." That's not an answer. A pulse flickered in his jaw. Vanessa noticed. She noticed everything. "That's because this isn't a conversation," Graham said quietly. "It's cross-examination." For a brief moment, something shifted behind her eyes. Hurt, or imitation of hurt. Sometimes he genuinely could not tell anymore. "You think I enjoy this?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "I think you need it." The words landed harder than he intended. Vanessa folded her arms tightly across herself, though whether for protection or restraint, Graham couldn't tell. "You disappear emotionally for months," she said. "You barely touch me anymore. You work late constantly." And somehow I'm irrational for noticing. Graham opened his mouth, closed it, because the worst part was that she wasn't entirely wrong. Their marriage had become a house filled with careful movements. They still hosted dinner parties, still attended charity events, still kissed each other goodbye in the mornings. But intimacy had become choreography. At night, Vanessa often lay awake beside him, scrolling silently through her phone, while Graham stared into darkness, pretending sleep would come eventually. Neither mentioned the distance directly anymore. Instead, they discussed symptoms, schedules, tone, behavior, evidence. "I have a client meeting," Graham said finally. Vanessa nodded once. Then she walked toward him slowly until she stood close enough for him to smell her perfume. Jasmine and something sharper underneath. "You know what the cruelest part is?" she asked softly. "What if you were actually having an affair? At least this would make sense." Then she left. The office suddenly felt colder. Graham remained motionless for several seconds before rubbing both hands across his face. 42 years old, award-winning architect, financially successful, respected, and increasingly unsure whether he was losing his marriage or his grip on reality. That evening, downtown Chicago glittered beneath fresh rain. The redevelopment presentation at the Lexington Hotel project stretched longer than expected. Investors argued over budget reallocations while junior associates pretended not to panic. Graham sat at the end of the conference table, loosening his tie slightly. "You look exhausted." He glanced sideways. Elise Bennett, new senior project consultant, 36, intelligent eyes, minimal makeup, the kind of beauty that emerged gradually instead of announcing itself immediately. She slid a coffee toward him. "Black," she said. You looked like someone who forgot dinner. Did I look that tragic a little? He almost smiled. Almost. That alone surprised him. Elise leaned back in her chair while executives continued debating around them. Tough week, she asked carefully. Graham gave the standard answer automatically. Just busy. Elise nodded like someone who recognized lies people told to survive conversations. My ex-husband used to say that, she replied. Graham glanced at her. And was he busy? Sometimes. She stirred her coffee absently. Mostly he was unhappy. The simplicity of the statement unsettled him. No drama, no bitterness, just truth stripped clean. For reasons he couldn't explain, Graham suddenly became aware of how long it had been since someone spoke plainly around him. Not strategically, not defensively, just honestly. The meeting finally ended, close to 10. People gathered laptops and winter coats while muttering exhausted goodnights. You parked where Elise asked, garage on Wabash. I'm heading that direction. Chicago wind slapped violently against them the second they stepped outside. Elise laughed while holding her coat closed. God, I forgot how brutal this city gets. Graham found himself laughing quietly too. Not because anything was particularly funny, because for 10 seconds beside her, he felt strangely normal. They walked half a block together under streaks of reflected neon. Then his phone buzzed. Vanessa. Of course. He stared at the screen a moment too long. Elise noticed without commenting. You should probably answer, she said gently. Graham nodded, but before he could, another message appeared. Still at work. Short. Simple. Yet somehow accusatory, even without punctuation. His chest tightened. You okay, Elise asked. He looked at the phone again, then at the wet street stretching endlessly ahead, and for the first time in years, a thought entered his mind that frightened him more than any accusation Vanessa had ever made. He understood how affairs begin, not through lust, not suddenly, but through relief, the terrifying relief of being seen without suspicion. Graham slipped the phone back into his pocket, unanswered. I should go, he said. Elise gave a small nod. Good night, Graham. As she disappeared into the moving crowd, he stood motionless beneath the freezing Chicago rain, already feeling guilty for something that had not happened. And somewhere deep inside him, something had already started breaking. The first snowfall arrived 3 days later. Chicago wore snow differently than other cities. In photographs, it looked cinematic. White rooftops, glowing windows, couples hurrying beneath scarves and streetlights. But up close, the city became quieter in winter, more isolated. Snow absorbed sound until even loneliness felt muffled. Graham noticed Vanessa humming in the kitchen that morning. That alone felt unusual. For months, maybe longer, their mornings had followed a predictable emotional geometry, polite conversation, restrained tension, careful eye contact. But now Vanessa moved around the marble kitchen island with an ease that felt almost theatrical. Coffee steamed beside her untouched. Her phone rested face down near the sink. You're in a good mood, Graham said cautiously. Vanessa smiled without looking at him. Am I not allowed to be? That's not what I meant. She finally turned. Calm, beautiful, impossible to read. I've just been thinking, she replied. Maybe I've been too hard on you lately. The words should have relieved him. Instead, something tightened quietly in his chest. Because Vanessa never released suspicion without replacing it with something else. What changed, he asked. She shrugged lightly. Maybe I'm tired of fighting ghosts. Ghosts. That was what she called his imagined affairs now. Not accusations anymore. Ghosts. Invisible things haunting the marriage. Graham poured coffee, slowly watching her reflection in the dark kitchen windows. Vanessa. Yes. You really believe I'd cheat on you? The question lingered between them longer than expected. Not because she didn't have an answer, because she was choosing one. Finally, she tilted her head slightly. I think she said softly, people become strangers long before they become unfaithful. Then she picked up her purse, kissed his cheek with careful warmth, and left for work. The silence afterward felt deliberate, like she had placed something sharp on the table and walked away before he could identify it. That afternoon, Graham found himself thinking about Elise again. Not obsessively, not romantically, just repeatedly. There was something unsettling about how easy conversation felt around her. No hidden meanings. No emotional landmines disguised as ordinary questions. At lunch during the Lexington redevelopment review, Elise sat across from him, flipping through revised GOM and structural layouts. You're doing it again, she said. Graham looked up. Doing what leaving conversations halfway through in your head. He blinked once, surprised. Is it that obvious? To someone paying attention? A faint smile touched her mouth. God, that smile felt dangerous in ways he didn't entirely understand. Not seductive. Human, which somehow felt worse. You ever get the feeling, Graham said carefully, that someone's already decided who you are, and no matter what you say afterward, it stops mattering? Elise studied him quietly. My mother used to do that, she admitted. Once she believed something emotionally, facts became irrelevant. That sounds exhausting. It was. She paused. Marriage shouldn't feel like a courtroom, Graham. The sentence hit too directly. He looked away first. Outside the restaurant windows, pedestrians crossed Michigan Avenue beneath blowing snow while taxis painted yellow streaks through slush-covered streets. You don't talk about your wife much, Elise said gently. There's not much to say. That's usually not true when people say it. For a moment, he considered telling her everything. The accusations, the exhaustion, the strange erosion of self-confidence that came from constantly defending your own reality. But another part of him pulled back immediately, because emotional intimacy had its own gravity, and he was already standing too close to the edge. My marriage is complicated, he said finally. Elise nodded once. Then mercifully, she let the silence remain untouched. That evening, Graham came home earlier than usual. The house was dark except for the dining room light. Vanessa sat alone at the table with a glass of red wine, her laptop open beside her. She looked up immediately when he entered. You're home early, so are you. A flicker crossed her face, tiny, almost invisible. I canceled dinner plans. With who? The question escaped before he could stop it. Vanessa smiled slowly. Interesting, that smile said. Now you're asking questions too, Claire and Nina, she replied smoothly. Why no reason? He loosened his scarf while studying her more carefully. Her wine glass was half full, but there were 2 plates in the sink. You already ate, yes. With Claire and Nina. Another pause, another calculation. No, Vanessa said calmly. I wasn't hungry earlier. Something about the answer felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Worse, precisely wrong. Like dialogue revised too carefully. Graham opened the refrigerator door, mostly to avoid staring at her. You know, Vanessa said softly behind him. You've become suspicious lately. He turned slowly. What? You watch me now. She sipped her wine. The way I used to watch you. That's not true. Isn't it? Her tone remained maddeningly gentle. Not a fight. An observation. Graham suddenly remembered something Elise had said. Facts become irrelevant. He closed the refrigerator harder than intended. Vanessa barely reacted. That bothered him too. Normally she reacted to everything. You want to know something strange? She asked. Would I almost prefer this version of you? He frowned. What version? The one capable of doubt. The room seemed to cool several degrees. Vanessa? What the hell does that mean? She stood slowly from the table. For a second, Graham saw exhaustion crack through her composure. Real exhaustion, not performative. Then it vanished again. It means, she said quietly, that certainty is lonely. She walked upstairs without another word. Graham remained standing in the kitchen, staring at the untouched second wine glass near the sink. 2 plates, 2 glasses, canceled dinner plans, and yet the house smelled faintly of unfamiliar cologne. Not strong, just enough to notice if you lived there. At 2 a.m, Graham woke to the soft glow of light beneath the bathroom door. Vanessa was inside, whispering. He sat upright slowly. The whispering stopped immediately. Seconds later, the faucet turned on, then off. The bathroom door opened. Vanessa froze slightly upon seeing him awake. Sorry, she murmured. Did I wake you? You were on the phone. No, I wasn't. Too quick, too smooth. Graham stared at her. You were talking to someone. I couldn't sleep. You said words, Vanessa. She crossed her arms loosely. Defensive already. I was listening to a podcast at 2 a.m. You think that's suspicious now? There it was again, the reversal. Every question redirected back toward him. Graham rubbed a hand across his face. I'm not trying to fight. Neither am I. But both of them knew that wasn't true anymore. Fights implied honesty. This had become something else entirely. Vanessa climbed back into bed beside him, turning away almost immediately. A familiar distance settled between their bodies beneath the expensive linen sheets. Yet Graham stayed awake long after her breathing slowed, because something fundamental had shifted inside him. For years, Vanessa had made him feel observed, measured, investigated. But now for the first time, he was observing her back. And once he started noticing the inconsistencies, he couldn't stop. Deleted notifications disappearing from her phone screen. Meetings she mentioned only after they happened. Emotional reactions arriving half a second too late, as though selected rather than felt. It wasn't proof, not yet. but it was enough to awaken a terrifying possibility. Maybe Vanessa had never truly been searching for evidence against him. Maybe she had only been preparing defenses for herself. And somewhere in the darkness beside her sleeping body, Graham felt the first unmistakable crack split through the foundation of their marriage. The snow stayed for a week. By Friday, Chicago had transformed into a city of muted colors and hard edges, softened temporarily by white. Cars moved slower, conversations shortened, people hurried through cold like they were outrunning invisible grief. Inside Mercer and Vale, however, tension moved differently. Warmer, closer, dangerous. Graham noticed it in the way coworkers stopped speaking when he entered conference rooms, in the subtle glances exchanged between assistants, in the strange politeness from people who usually joked with him freely. At first he assumed he was imagining it. Then came the elevator ride. "You okay?" Graham turned toward Daniel Reeves from Project Finance, a man he'd worked beside for nearly 6 years. "Why wouldn't I be?" Daniel hesitated. That hesitation alone said too much. "Nothing," he muttered. "Forget it." The elevator doors opened. Daniel exited almost immediately without another word. Graham remained inside another moment longer, pulse tightening slowly beneath his collar. Something was happening, and somehow he was the last person seeing it. That night, the Lexington team worked late, finalizing revised presentations before Monday's investor review. By 11, the office floor had mostly emptied, leaving only scattered desk lamps glowing against dark glass walls. Elise sat cross-legged in a chair, reviewing digital renderings while soft jazz played quietly from someone's abandoned speaker. "You ever notice," she said without looking up, "how office buildings feel haunted after midnight?" Graham glanced around. Rows of empty workstations, stretched through dim light like abandoned lives, paused. "Temporarily." "That's reassuring." "I'm serious." Elise smiled faintly. "All these people spending more time here than at home." Eventually something lingers. Something about the word home unsettled him instantly. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. "I used to love architecture," he admitted quietly. Elise looked up. "Used to. When I was younger, I thought buildings could fix things." He stared toward the snowy skyline outside. "Create stability, meaning, places where people felt safe. And now I mostly build expensive glass boxes for people pretending they're happy." The honesty surprised even him. Elise watched him carefully for several seconds. "You know what I think?" she asked softly. "What I think you're lonely." The room became very still. Not dramatic, not romantic. Worse, true. Graham looked down at the architectural plans spread across the table between them. "I'm married," he said quietly. "That wasn't my question." He laughed once under his breath, though no amusement existed in it. "You always this direct? Only when someone looks like they're drowning politely." The sentence hit him with almost physical force. Because that was exactly what this had become. A polite drowning. Years of measured conversations, controlled disappointments, emotional negotiations disguised as marriage. And suddenly he was sitting beside someone who saw the exhaustion immediately without requiring explanation. That intimacy frightened him. "I don't even know when things changed," Graham admitted after a long silence. "One day we were just managing each other instead of loving each other." Elise closed her laptop slowly. "You don't have to convince me your marriage is difficult. I know. But you sound like you're trying to convince yourself." Outside, snow drifted past the windows in soft spirals beneath city lights. Graham realized then how dangerously comfortable he had become beside her. Not because he wanted her, because he could breathe around her, and that distinction suddenly felt terrifyingly thin. "My wife thinks I'm having an affair," he confessed quietly. Elise didn't react immediately. "With you?" The question lingered. Graham swallowed once. "She's never said your name directly, but she suspects." "Yes." Elise leaned back, slowly processing. "That must make this awkward." "It makes everything awkward." Silence stretched between them again, heavy now, aware of itself. Then Elise spoke carefully. "For what it's worth, I don't think emotional betrayal starts where people think it does." Graham looked at her. "It starts," she continued softly, "when someone becomes the first person you want to talk to instead of the person waiting at home." Neither moved, neither looked away. And in that suspended moment, Graham felt something inside himself shift with horrifying clarity. Not desire, recognition. His marriage wasn't collapsing physically first. It was collapsing emotionally. Maybe it already had. His phone vibrated violently against the table. Vanessa. The screen illuminated across both their faces. Elise looked away immediately. Graham answered after the third ring. "Hey, you're still at work?" Not a question. "Yes, with Elise." His blood went cold. Slowly, completely. Graham sat upright. How do you know Elise is here? Silence. Tiny, measured. Then Vanessa laughed softly. You said the Lexington team was staying late. That doesn't answer my question. You sound nervous. I'm asking how you knew she was here. Another pause. Then her voice changed subtly. Not louder, sharper. You know what's interesting, Graham? His stomach tightened. What I used to think affairs happened suddenly. Her breathing remained calm through the phone. But now I think they happen in pieces. The office suddenly felt claustrophobic. What are you talking about? You tell me. Then she hung up. Elise stared at him carefully from across the table. What was that? Graham looked at the dead phone screen in disbelief. I don't know anymore. But deep down, he did know one thing. Vanessa sounded less suspicious than certain. When Graham arrived home near midnight, the penthouse lights were dim except for the living room. Vanessa sat curled on the sofa, wearing silk pajamas, scrolling through her tablet. She looked peaceful. That frightened him immediately. We need to talk, Graham said. Vanessa glanced up calmly. About Elise. There it was again. Too direct, too prepared. How do you know about her? You work together? That's not what I mean. Vanessa set the tablet aside slowly. I saw the photos. The room tilted slightly. What photos? Without speaking, she reached for her phone and opened a message thread. Then she handed the device toward him. Graham felt his pulse drop into something cold and mechanical. 3 photographs, taken through the Lexington office windows. Him and Elise sitting closely together, talking, leaning toward each other across the conference table. In the final image, Elise's hand rested briefly over his wrist. Nothing explicit, nothing physical beyond that. Yet somehow deeply intimate, private. How the hell did you get these? Vanessa watched him instead of the photos. That's your concern. Someone was photographing us. You mean someone noticed? There's nothing happening, isn't there? Her tone remained infuriatingly composed. Graham stared at the timestamp. 10:43 p.m. Less than 2 hours ago. This is insane. Vanessa stood slowly. No, she said quietly. Insane is spending years feeling someone disappear while they insist nothing's wrong. You had someone follow me. I didn't need to. That's not an answer. And yours never are either. For the first time in months, genuine anger surged through him. Because beneath the accusation was something darker now. Surveillance, manipulation. How long have you been doing this? Vanessa folded her arms. Doing what? Watching me like I'm a criminal. A flicker crossed her face then. Not guilt. Pain. Real pain. You know what the worst part is, she whispered. You still think this started with Elise. Graham frowned. What does that mean? But Vanessa shook her head slowly. You've already left this marriage emotionally, she said. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. That's not true. Then why do you look happier coming home from work than being here with me? The question hit harder because it was true, and they both knew it. Vanessa looked away first, this time. For one devastating moment, Graham saw beneath all the suspicion and sharpness. Fear. Not fear of losing him, fear of losing control of the story. Then the mask returned instantly. You should sleep, she said softly. You have an early meeting tomorrow. She walked upstairs before he could answer. Graham remained standing alone in the dim living room, staring at the photographs, still glowing on her abandoned phone. Someone had been watching. Someone had captured a private moment with impossible timing, and somehow Vanessa had received the images almost immediately. His chest tightened as realization crept slowly through him. This was no longer jealousy. Jealousy was emotional, messy, human. This felt organized, deliberate. And for the first time since the accusations began years ago, Graham experienced something more dangerous than guilt. He experienced fear. By Monday morning, the isolation had fully begun. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. A junior associate avoided eye contact entirely. Even Elise seemed more guarded tension visible behind her professionalism. Finally, near noon, Graham cornered Daniel Reeves near the break room. What's going on? Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately. You really don't know. Know what? Daniel exhaled heavily. There are rumors, Graham. What rumors? That you and Elise... He hesitated. People think it started months ago. Graham stared at him. That's impossible. Daniel gave him a look filled with sympathy and caution. Someone's been talking. The words echoed sickeningly in Graham's mind. Someone's been talking. And suddenly he understood the true horror of manipulation. Not merely being accused, but being slowly rewritten in other people's minds until your innocence itself began sounding dishonest. By December, Graham began living like a man, reviewing security footage of his own life. Every memory became evidence. Every argument required reevaluation. The terrifying part wasn't discovering new lies. It was realizing how many old moments suddenly looked different under altered light. Chicago moved deeper into winter, while Graham moved deeper into suspicion. Not Vanessa's suspicion of him, his suspicion of reality itself. The first unmistakable crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Graham sat alone in his office, reviewing revised blueprints, when his assistant knocked softly against the glass door. "There's someone here asking for you," she said carefully. "Who?" She wouldn't give a name. A woman entered moments later, wearing a navy wool coat dusted with snow, mid-30s, nervous posture, familiar somehow. Then Graham recognized her. Lena Ortiz, former hostess from a restaurant he and Vanessa used to frequent downtown. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quickly. I didn't know who else to talk to." Graham frowned. "Is something wrong?" Lena glanced toward the office door before lowering her voice. "Your wife came to see me last year." Cold moved quietly through his stomach. "What?" "She asked questions about you." His body stilled completely. What kind of questions? Lena swallowed. "She wanted to know if you came to the restaurant with other women." The office suddenly felt soundless. Graham stared at her. "She showed me photos," Lena continued uneasily. "Pictures of women from your office. Asked if I'd seen you with them privately." "When was this?" "Over a year ago." "A year. Before Elise. Before the recent accusations intensified. Before most of the incidents Graham had convinced himself marked the beginning of their collapse." "She offered me money," Lena admitted quietly. "Not to lie exactly. Just to call her if I noticed anything unusual." Graham leaned back slowly in his chair. Something inside his chest was beginning to fracture open. "Why are you telling me this now?" Lena hesitated. "Because she came back recently." Her expression tightened, and this time she asked about Elise Bennett specifically. The room tilted subtly beneath him. "She knew Elise before I even mentioned her?" "Yes." Graham looked out the office windows toward the frozen Chicago River below. For several seconds he couldn't speak, because suddenly dozens of moments began rearranging themselves inside his memory. Vanessa casually asking about new female employees months earlier, her strange calmness after meeting Elise briefly at a corporate fundraiser, the immediate certainty in her accusations. Not guesses. Preparation. How did she know Elise's name? Graham asked quietly. Lena shook her head. "I don't know." But Graham was starting to. Vanessa had not been reacting. She had been tracking. That night, Graham sat alone in his car outside their building for nearly 40 minutes before going upstairs. Snow collected along the windshield while memories replayed themselves mercilessly. Their 10th anniversary dinner. Vanessa accusing him afterward of flirting with the waitress because he smiled during conversation. The fundraising gala 2 years earlier. Vanessa asking repeatedly whether Graham found a junior associate attractive. A vacation in Napa where she suddenly burst into tears after seeing him answer a work call from a female client. At the time, each incident had felt isolated. Now they resembled connected points in a design, a structure, an architecture, and Graham horrifyingly had been living inside it without seeing the blueprint. Vanessa stood barefoot in the kitchen when he entered the penthouse. Soft music played from hidden speakers. Candlelight flickered against marble countertops. Normal. Carefully normal? "You're late," she said without turning around. "I had meetings." Vanessa smiled faintly at the irony. "Of course you did." Normally the comment would have triggered another exhausting circular argument. Tonight Graham simply watched her, observed her. The way she stirred wine slowly without drinking it, the way her shoulders remained too relaxed, the way she always seemed emotionally prepared before conversations even began. "You went to see Lena Ortiz last year," he said quietly. The spoon stopped moving, only for half a second. But he saw it. Vanessa turned slowly. "I don't know who that is." Lie. Clean. Instant. Graham felt something icy settle permanently inside him. "She worked at Bellevue." Recognition flickered across Vanessa's face before disappearing. "Why are you investigating me now?" she asked calmly. Not denial. Redirection. Because that's what she always did. You paid her to monitor me. I was worried about my husband. "A year ago, you think affairs begin overnight?" There it was again. That phrase. Affairs begin in pieces. Except now Graham understood something horrifying. Vanessa had been searching for those pieces long before they existed, maybe even placing them herself. "You already believed I was cheating before there was any reason to," he said slowly. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Women notice distance before men admit it." "No." Graham stepped closer. You were building a case. The silence between them sharpened instantly. For the first time in years, Vanessa looked genuinely unsettled, not emotionally, strategically. You're being dramatic. Am I? Yes. Then tell me why rumors about me and Elise existed before anything happened. Nothing, just a slight narrowing of her eyes. Graham continued. How did photographs appear the same night we worked late? His voice lowered. How did you know her name before I ever mentioned her? Vanessa stared at him with frightening stillness. Then slowly she laughed once. Not warmly, not cruelly either, more like exhaustion finally surfacing. You really want the truth, she asked softly. Yes. You've been leaving me for years. The answer hit him with confusing force, because part of it felt honest, and that was what made Vanessa dangerous. She buried manipulation beneath real pain. You don't get to rewrite this, Graham said quietly. Her composure cracked slightly then. Rewrite, she repeated. I spent years watching my husband disappear emotionally while pretending everything was fine. So you manufactured evidence I paid attention. You orchestrated situations. I protected myself. The distinction horrified him, because in her mind those things had become identical. Graham suddenly remembered every moment he'd doubted himself over the years, every apology for things he hadn't done, every defensive explanation, every night spent questioning harmless interactions until he felt guilty simply for existing around other women. Vanessa had not merely accused him of betrayal, she had conditioned him to inhabit it psychologically. You wanted me to feel guilty, he realized aloud. Vanessa looked away. That's not fair, but true. Her jaw tightened. You know what's funny, she whispered. Eventually you started behaving exactly like someone hiding an affair. Graham stared at her in disbelief. Because she was right. The defensiveness, the secrecy born from exhaustion, the emotional withdrawal. She had created the atmosphere of infidelity so completely that he eventually adapted to surviving inside it, like a prisoner learning prison habits. My God, he murmured. Vanessa's eyes glistened suddenly. You think this was easy for me? Yes, Graham said honestly. I think controlling people is easier for you than trusting them. The words landed like broken glass. For the first time, genuine anger flashed openly across her face. You have no idea what it feels like, she snapped, to love someone while constantly sensing them slipping away. Then you should have talked to me. I did! Her voice cracked violently through the kitchen. The sudden emotional eruption startled both of them. Vanessa pressed trembling fingers against her lips, regaining composure almost immediately. But Graham had seen it now. Beneath all the manipulation lived something real. Fear, abandonment, a desperate need for control born from terror of helplessness. Yet understanding it did not make it less destructive. It made it sadder. You don't know how to love without surveillance, Graham said quietly. Vanessa's breathing slowed. You don't know how to stay. They stood facing each other, across the kitchen island like survivors of separate disasters, neither entirely innocent anymore, neither entirely wrong, but only one of them had spent years engineering emotional traps, and Graham finally understood the full psychological horror of it. Vanessa had been slowly constructing a version of reality where his betrayal felt inevitable, not because she discovered infidelity, because she needed it to exist. 3 nights later, another piece finally fell into place. Graham attended a small holiday fundraiser alone after Vanessa claimed she felt sick. Halfway through the evening, Claire Monroe, one of Vanessa's closest friends, cornered him near the bar with visible discomfort. I probably shouldn't say this, Claire murmured. Graham already felt tired. Say what? Claire glanced around carefully. Vanessa's been talking about your affair for months. His stomach dropped. What affair? She never gave details, just implied things. Claire hesitated. Honestly, most of us thought she already had proof. How long? Claire looked genuinely confused. At least a year, again. Not suspicion, preparation, narrative construction. Graham stood motionless as conversations blurred around him beneath golden ballroom lights. And suddenly he saw the terrifying brilliance of Vanessa's strategy. She had never accused him publicly outright. That would have sounded unstable. Instead, she planted concern carefully. Questions, doubts, observations, enough to make future revelations feel believable when they arrived. Like an architect quietly preparing foundation work before construction begins. And all this time, Graham had mistaken her manipulation for insecurity. But insecurity reacts. This required planning, patience, design. As snow fell heavily beyond the ballroom windows, Graham realized something devastating. His marriage had not been collapsing naturally. Someone had been steering it toward destruction for years. And the worst part was no longer wondering why. The worst part was realizing Vanessa still hadn't revealed what she was truly protecting. The first time Graham heard Adrian Keller's name connected to his wife, he almost dismissed it. Not because it seemed impossible, because it seemed too obvious. Adrian Keller existed in the kind of social orbit people like Vanessa admired instinctively. Wealth wrapped in restraint power, disguised as elegance. He was one of Chicago's most influential private investors, the sort of man photographed at museum galas beside senators and actresses, always smiling slightly like someone privately entertained by the room around him. Graham had met him twice, maybe 3 times. Each encounter left the same impression, controlled charm, hiding something colder beneath. And now, standing in the freezing underground parking garage beneath Mercer and Vale at 7:30 on a Thursday night, Graham stared at a photograph on his phone that made his pulse slow into something dangerously calm. Vanessa, Adrian, outside the Langford Hotel downtown, 3 weeks ago, close enough to touch. The image had come anonymously from a burner email address 30 minutes earlier. No message attached, just the photograph. At first glance, nothing explicitly incriminating appeared in it. 2 adults standing beside a black town car, Vanessa looking upward toward Adrian while he adjusted her scarf with intimate familiarity. But Graham recognized the expression on her face immediately, because he hadn't seen her look at him that way in years. Soft, unarmored, real. His hands tightened around the phone, then loosened again. Oddly, the dominant feeling wasn't rage. It was clarity, like the final piece of a blurred image sliding into place. He didn't confront her immediately. That frightened him most. 3 months earlier, Graham would have stormed home demanding answers. Emotion would have overwhelmed strategy. Now he understood Vanessa too well. Direct confrontation only gave her time to reshape reality. So instead, Graham began quietly searching. And once he started, the trail appeared everywhere. Small things first. Credit card charges at restaurants Vanessa claimed never to visit. Private membership payments linked to Keller Foundation events. Hotel reservations canceled minutes before confirmation emails reached shared accounts. Nothing definitive alone. Together, devastating. The deeper Graham looked, the more he discovered an invisible second life woven carefully beneath their marriage. And somehow that hurt worse than physical betrayal. Because affairs were one thing. But sustained deception required maintenance, planning, emotional compartmentalization. It meant Vanessa had looked him in the eyes thousands of times while protecting another reality. Saturday evening arrived, wrapped in sleet and gray skies. Vanessa stood before the bedroom mirror, fastening diamond earrings before another charity function. "You're quiet lately," she observed casually. Graham adjusted his cufflinks without looking at her. "Maybe I'm learning from you." A faint smile touched her lips. "Is that supposed to mean something? You tell me." Their reflections watched each other from opposite sides of the room. 2 elegant strangers dressed for social performance. Vanessa stepped closer slowly. "You know," she murmured, smoothing his tie with practiced tenderness, "there was a time you used to talk to me." Graham looked down at her hand, resting briefly against his chest. The intimacy felt almost surreal now, like muscle memory surviving after emotional death. And there was a time, he replied quietly, when you didn't treat love like an investigation. Something flickered across her face. Regret, or recognition. Then it disappeared beneath composure. "You still think this is all about control, isn't it?" Vanessa met his eyes in the mirror. "No," she said softly. "It's about survival." The word lingered unpleasantly in the air. Survival from what? That question followed him all night. The gala occupied the upper floors of the Halstead Museum, overlooking the frozen river. Wealth moved through the building in tailored black suits and expensive perfume. Graham spent most of the evening studying Vanessa instead of speaking to anyone, and once he began truly observing her patterns, emerged immediately. The subtle tension before certain text messages arrived, the unconscious scan across crowded rooms, the tiny emotional shifts whenever Adrian Keller entered proximity. It wasn't dramatic. That was the terrifying part. People imagined affairs as explosions. In reality, they resembled gravity, quiet forces pulling bodies toward each other invisibly over time. Around 9:30, Graham watched Vanessa disappear briefly toward a private balcony corridor. 3 minutes later, Adrian followed. Graham remained perfectly still. Then he counted slowly to 20 before walking after them. The corridor beyond the ballroom stood dimly lit and mostly empty, overlooking snowy Chicago through towering glass panels. Voices echoed softly from around the corner. Becoming paranoid, Vanessa whispered sharply. Adrian sounded calm. "He already suspects something. He suspects everything. Then maybe stop pushing him." Silence. Then Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You think I wanted this?" Graham stopped breathing. Adrian's voice lowered. You wanted protection. Protection, not love. Not passion. Protection. Vanessa answered more quietly this time. I needed time. Graham moved closer instinctively before stopping himself. Every instinct screamed to confront them immediately, but something colder kept him still. Because for the first time, he wasn't reacting emotionally. He was finally listening. He can't know about the accounts, Vanessa whispered. Graham's blood froze. Accounts, Adrian answered instantly. He won't. He's smarter than you think. And you're unraveling. Another silence followed. Then Adrian spoke again, softer now. You should have divorced him years ago. Vanessa's response came almost immediately. You know why I couldn't. Graham closed his eyes briefly, not because he was shocked, because part of him already knew. The accusations, the surveillance, the narrative construction. It had never merely been emotional instability. Vanessa had been preparing legal and social cover. If their marriage collapsed, she needed Graham positioned publicly as the unfaithful husband before anyone discovered whatever existed between her and Adrian. Defensive warfare. God. The realization hollowed him instantly. He stepped backward quietly before either could notice him. Then he returned to the ballroom wearing the same calm expression he'd perfected during years of surviving his marriage. Inside, however, something irreversible had finally broken. At home after midnight, Vanessa entered the penthouse 20 minutes after Graham. Not rushed, not guilty-looking, controlled, always controlled. You left early, she said while removing her gloves. I was tired. She studied him carefully. You seem different lately. Graham sat near the dark windows overlooking the city. Maybe I finally am. Vanessa remained standing. The distance between them suddenly felt immense. Not physical, historical. How long, Graham asked quietly. Her body stilled almost imperceptibly. Excuse me? You and Adrian? Silence. Pure, absolute. Then Vanessa laughed once, softly, though no amusement touched it. You've been investigating me. That's not denial. You followed me. I listened. That landed harder, because she understood immediately. The balcony, the conversation. Vanessa looked away first. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then slowly she sat across from him. Not defensive now. Not angry. Just tired. Were you ever going to tell me, Graham asked. Vanessa stared at the snow falling beyond the windows. It wasn't supposed to become serious. The sentence carved through him more painfully than denial would have. Not because of Adrian, because of the quiet resignation in her voice, as if the affair had happened gradually while she watched herself from a distance. How long? Another pause. 3 years. Graham felt physically ill. 3 years. 3 years of accusations. 3 years of surveillance. 3 years spent making him feel guilty while she protected her own betrayal. You accused me because you were cheating. No. Vanessa's voice sharpened instantly. I accused you because I knew what distance looked like. You engineered evidence. I panicked. You manipulated everyone around us. I was trying to survive. There's that word again. Vanessa pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. You don't understand. Then explain it. For the first time since this began, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Not fear of losing him. Fear of exposure. The investments Adrian made for me, she whispered. Some of them crossed ethical lines. Graham stared at her. What does that mean? It means if people look closely enough, it becomes a scandal. The room suddenly felt smaller. How involved are you? I didn't steal anything. That's not what I asked. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. He used my accounts for transactions connected to private acquisitions before public announcements. Graham went completely still. Insider trading, or something dangerously close to it. Oh my God, I never wanted it to go this far. But it did. Tears finally filled her eyes then. Real tears. Not strategic, not controlled, and somehow that made everything worse. Do you know what terrified me most? She whispered brokenly. Not losing you. Graham said nothing. It was knowing that if the truth surfaced, everyone would believe I destroyed our marriage. Her voice cracked. So I needed them to see you leaving first. The honesty stunned him silent, because beneath all the manipulation existed something profoundly human: cowardice, desperation, fear. Vanessa had built an entire psychological war not merely to hide infidelity, but to control perception before collapse arrived. And Graham suddenly understood why she watched him so obsessively for years. She needed him guilty, not legally, emotionally, socially, narratively. If he became the husband who emotionally abandoned his wife for another woman, then her own betrayal transformed into reaction instead of origin. God. She hadn't just been protecting secrets. She had been rewriting chronology itself. "You turned my life into a defense strategy," Graham said quietly. Vanessa closed her eyes. "I know. You made me question my own mind. I know. You made me feel ashamed for things you were doing." At that, Vanessa finally broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. She simply covered her face with both hands and began crying, with the exhausted grief of someone who had spent years holding collapsing walls upright alone. And Graham, sitting across from the woman he once loved, completely realized something devastating. The tragedy of manipulation was not that the manipulator felt nothing, it was that they often felt too much, and chose control instead of honesty. Outside, snow buried Chicago beneath silence, while inside the penthouse, the truth finally sat between them, fully exposed. Ugly, human, irreversible. After the confession, the penthouse became unbearably quiet, not peaceful. Vacant, like a building after structural damage. Still standing, but no longer trustworthy. For nearly a week, Graham and Vanessa moved through the apartment with the eerie politeness of strangers trapped together during a storm. Conversations narrowed to logistics: coffee, laundry, meetings, the weather. No one mentioned Adrian again. No one mentioned divorce either, but the word existed everywhere between them, in pauses, in eye contact avoided half a second too long. In the way Vanessa watched Graham now. Not suspicious anymore, but frightened, because suspicion still implied attachment. Fear meant she felt him disappearing, and for the first time in years, Graham truly was. The emotional numbness surprised him most. He had imagined rage would consume him after learning the truth. Instead, he felt hollowed out, like someone waking after years under anesthesia, only to discover entire sections of their life had already been amputated. At work, he functioned automatically. Meetings, blueprint revisions, investor calls. But internally, something fundamental had detached. Even Elise noticed immediately. "You look exhausted," she said one evening while they reviewed lighting plans in a near-empty conference room. Graham gave a tired smile. "That obvious, you've looked exhausted before." She studied him carefully. "This is different." He leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside, the glass walls, downtown Chicago, shimmered beneath freezing rain and blurred headlights. "I found out why Vanessa accused me all those years." Elise remained quiet, waiting, not pushing. That restraint alone made him trust her more than he probably should have. "She was having an affair," he said, finally. Elise's expression shifted. Not shock exactly, but sadness. "With who, Adrian Keller?" Recognition flickered instantly across her face. The investor Graham nodded. "And the accusations?" she asked carefully. "She needed me to look guilty first." The room became very still. Graham explained everything then. The photographs, the rumors, the engineered suspicions, the financial entanglements hidden beneath Vanessa's panic. He spoke calmly, almost clinically, which frightened Elise more than anger would have, because calm meant the damage had gone deeper than emotion. When he finally finished, Elise stared at him in disbelief. "My God. Yeah. She manipulated everyone around you. She manipulated me into questioning my own reality." The sentence lingered heavily between them. Elise closed her laptop slowly. "You know what this sounds like?" Graham looked at her. "Psychological conditioning." He laughed quietly under his breath. "Comforting. I'm serious." She leaned forward now, voice softer. "If someone spends years making you defend yourself against accusations, eventually your brain starts organizing itself around guilt, whether you're guilty or not." Graham rubbed his jaw tiredly. "I know." "No," Elise said carefully. "I don't think you do." He looked at her again. "You still apologize constantly." The observation hit immediately because it was true. He apologized for late emails, for needing clarification, for minor frustrations during meetings, for taking up space emotionally. As though years beside Vanessa had trained him to believe tension automatically originated from him. "She made you responsible for her fear," Elise whispered. Graham looked away toward the rain-streaked skyline. "And I let her." "No." Elise's voice remained calm but firm. "You survived it." The distinction nearly undid him, because after months of suspicion and emotional warfare, simple compassion now felt almost unbearable. He stood abruptly. "I should go, Elle. I should really go." Elise understood immediately. This wasn't avoidance. It was fear. Fear of becoming emotionally dependent on the first person who saw him clearly in years. And maybe fear that Vanessa had been right about one thing: emotional betrayal did begin long before physical lines were crossed. When Graham arrived home that night, he found Vanessa cooking. Actual cooking. Not catered food reheated elegantly. Pasta simmered on the stove while jazz drifted quietly through the kitchen speakers. The scene felt so unfamiliar, it almost unsettled him more than conflict. "You're home late," she said softly. "Work," Vanessa nodded, with Elise. There it was, not accusation anymore. Monitoring, even now. Graham removed his coat carefully. "Yes." Vanessa stirred the sauce without looking at him. "How is she?" The question felt wrong instantly. Too calm, too casual. Graham studied her closely. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," she smiled faintly. "I'm trying honesty for once." He almost laughed. Instead, he walked toward the refrigerator silently. "You know," Vanessa said after a moment, "Claire saw you together Tuesday night." Graham froze. "We were working at a wine bar." He turned slowly. "What?" Vanessa finally looked at him. Sympathetic, almost gentle. "She said you looked intimate. That's ridiculous." "Is it?" His pulse began slowing into something cold, because suddenly he understood. Again, the timing, the witnesses, the carefully planted observations. "Claire didn't accidentally see us, did she?" Vanessa's silence answered immediately. Graham stared at her in disbelief. "You sent her there. I wanted to know the truth." "No," he said quietly. "You wanted documentation." Something dangerous flickered behind Vanessa's eyes then. Not guilt, desperation. "You think I don't see what's happening?" she asked sharply. "You come home lighter after seeing her, because she talks to me like I'm human." The words landed brutally. Vanessa recoiled almost invisibly. But Graham kept going now. "She doesn't interrogate every silence. She doesn't build traps and call them love. I was trying to hold on to my marriage. You were trying to control the narrative." Vanessa's composure cracked. "You emotionally left me first, and you made sure everyone would believe that." The kitchen fell silent, except for simmering water. Vanessa looked at him with the exhausted fury of someone losing a war they spent years preparing for. Then unexpectedly her voice softened. "What if I'm right?" Graham frowned. What? What if you really are falling in love with her?" The question hit harder because he didn't immediately know the answer. Not love, not yet, but attachment, trust, relief, yes. And Vanessa saw the hesitation. Her face changed instantly. Not heartbreak, calculation, like someone finally confirming a theory. "Oh," she whispered. Graham suddenly felt sick, because he understood exactly what she was thinking, if he crossed the line now, emotionally or physically. Then everything she'd constructed became validated retroactively. The years of suspicion, the rumors, the accusations, all transformed into prophecy instead of manipulation. "You want this to happen," he realized quietly. Vanessa didn't answer. Didn't need to. "My God," Graham murmured. "You need me to become the villain?" Vanessa's eyes filled suddenly. "You already are in my head." The honesty in that sentence was devastating, because she meant it. After years of fear, projection, and betrayal, Vanessa genuinely no longer knew where suspicion ended and reality began, and perhaps neither did he. The next afternoon, Graham asked Elise to meet him somewhere private, not a restaurant, not a bar, too public, too vulnerable to interpretation. Instead, they met inside an unfinished luxury condominium project overlooking Lake Michigan. One Mercer and Vale had designed, but not yet completed. Empty rooms echoed softly around them, exposed concrete, cold winter light, a city suspended outside massive windows. "It's beautiful," Elise said quietly. "It's hollow," Graham replied. The unintended symbolism hung between them immediately. Elise turned toward him carefully. "What's wrong?" Graham didn't answer right away, because saying it aloud made it real. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "Vanessa's trying to push us together." Elise blinked. "What?" "She's arranging sightings, planting rumors, positioning us publicly." His jaw tightened. "She needs proof of an affair." Understanding spread gradually across Elise's face. "She's creating witnesses." "Yes." The horror of it settled heavily into the unfinished room. Elise crossed her arms tightly. "That's insane." "No." Graham stared out toward the gray lake beyond the windows. "It's strategic." He explained everything then, not only the affair with Adrian, but the years of manipulation leading toward this moment. Elise listened in stunned silence. When he finished, she looked genuinely shaken. "She's been constructing this version of you for years." "Yes, and now she's trying to finalize it." Graham nodded once. Elise walked slowly toward the windows. Snow drifted faintly across the shoreline below. "You know what scares me most," she said quietly. "What?" "She probably thinks she's justified." The answer landed with brutal accuracy, because Vanessa did believe it. In her mind, Graham's emotional closeness with Elise validated everything retroactively. Never mind that Vanessa herself had engineered the emotional starvation driving him elsewhere. Never mind that her own affair began years earlier. Payne rarely cared about chronology. "I don't want to become part of this," Elise whispered. Graham looked at her carefully. "You already are." She closed her eyes briefly. "I know." Silence filled the unfinished condo. Not awkward, just painfully aware. Finally, Elise turned back toward him. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I haven't crossed any lines with you." Graham swallowed. "I know. But emotionally," her voice faltered slightly. "Emotionally, this stopped being simple a long time ago." There it was. The truth neither of them wanted to say aloud. No affair had happened. Yet something undeniably intimate already existed between them. Not because of seduction, because shared honesty creates closeness faster than desire sometimes. Graham stepped closer slowly, not touching her, just near enough to feel the gravity between them. "I don't know what this is anymore," he admitted. Elise looked up at him with tired, searching eyes. "It's two lonely people finding relief in each other." The sentence nearly broke him, because it was true, and because Vanessa, in some twisted, horrifying way, had predicted it before either of them fully understood it themselves. Not through intuition alone, but through years of emotional pressure that slowly pushed Graham toward the exact vulnerability she feared most. Suddenly, Elise took a small step backward. "We need boundaries." Graham nodded immediately. "Yes, because if we don't," she looked away briefly, "then she wins." The brutal simplicity of that truth settled between them. Vanessa had spent years constructing a reality where Graham's betrayal became inevitable, and now the final battle was no longer about marriage. It was about whether Graham would allow pain to transform him into the man she always claimed he was. Outside evening settled over frozen Chicago, while inside the unfinished building, Graham finally understood the true breaking point of manipulation. The moment you become tempted to fulfill the lie simply because you're exhausted from defending yourself against it. The invitation arrived on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. The Keller Winter Foundation Gala, Saturday, 8 o'clock in the evening. The Halcyon Tower penthouse, black tie required. Vanessa left it unopened on the kitchen counter, like a threat neither of them wanted to acknowledge aloud. For 2 days, neither mentioned whether they were attending. Then on Friday night, Graham finally asked the question, "Are we pretending to still be married tomorrow?" Vanessa stood near the windows, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched. Snow drifted softly beyond the skyline. "I don't know," she answered honestly. It was the first completely honest thing she had said in weeks, maybe months. Graham studied her quietly. Since the confrontation about Adrian, Vanessa seemed physically smaller somehow. Not weaker, just stripped of the polished certainty she had worn for years like armor. Even her silences had changed. Before they felt strategic. Now they felt tired. "We should go," she said eventually. "Why?" "Because if we don't, people will know something's wrong." Graham almost laughed. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for years. But he understood what she truly meant. Narrative mattered. Appearance mattered. Vanessa had built her entire adult life around controlling perception, and tomorrow night perception was beginning to crack. The Halcyon Tower penthouse overlooked downtown Chicago like a throne above frozen light. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city beneath falling snow, while hundreds of guests moved through gold-tinted rooms carrying champagne and carefully rehearsed charm. Politicians, investors, museum directors, media executives, people who survive socially by never appearing emotionally honest. Graham suddenly understood why Adrian Keller thrived here. This world rewarded controlled performance. Vanessa belonged to it too. At least she used to. "You look pale," Vanessa murmured quietly beside him as they entered the main ballroom. "You look terrified." Her expression tightened. "Please don't do this tonight. Do what humiliate me." The fragility beneath her voice startled him. For years, Vanessa weaponized emotional control so skillfully that Graham had forgotten she could sound vulnerable. But vulnerability now changed nothing, because consequences had finally arrived. Adrian appeared moments later across the room surrounded by donors and political figures. Tall, silver-haired, immaculate. He smiled upon seeing them approach, though Graham noticed the microscopic hesitation before his expression settled fully into place. "Fear. Good." Graham Adrian greeted warmly. "Glad you could make it. You invited my wife." Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Adrian's smile dimmed almost imperceptibly. "And you," he replied smoothly, "are still her husband." For now, Graham thought, but he merely nodded. The three of them stood beneath soft chandelier light while conversations flowed around them, unaware of the fracture line running through the center of the room. Then Adrian leaned closer slightly. "Can we speak privately later?" Vanessa stiffened instantly. Graham noticed. "So there are private conversations now?" he asked calmly. Adrian held his gaze. "Not here." The answer itself was confirmation. Vanessa looked physically ill, and suddenly Graham realized something important. Neither of them knew how much he actually knew. That uncertainty terrified them more than anger ever could. An hour later, Graham stood alone near the western balcony, watching snow spiral across the skyline. The city below looked distant and unreal beneath winter fog. "You're handling this quietly." Claire Monroe stepped beside him, holding champagne. Graham gave a faint, humorless smile. "You sound disappointed." "No." Claire hesitated carefully. "Just surprised." He studied her profile. "You knew, didn't you?" Claire went still. "About Adrian?" "About all of it." She sighed softly into the cold glass reflection of the windows. "Not everything, but enough." Claire looked genuinely ashamed now. "Vanessa told people you were emotionally involved with Elise months ago." She swallowed. "Most of us believed her because, honestly, she sounded heartbroken." Graham nodded slowly. "That was the point." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" For several seconds, Graham considered staying silent, protecting Vanessa one final time. Then he remembered the photographs, the rumors, the years spent defending himself against realities she manufactured deliberately. And something inside him finally hardened completely. "You know what manipulation is, Claire?" he asked quietly. Her expression shifted uneasily. "Graham, it's when someone creates emotional evidence before real evidence exists." Claire stared at him. He continued calmly. "She had an affair with Adrian Keller for 3 years." The words landed like broken glass. Claire's face drained of color instantly. "What? She built a narrative around me long before anyone suspected her." Graham's voice remained terrifyingly steady. "The rumors about Elise weren't accidents. The surveillance wasn't paranoia. It was strategy." Claire shook her head slowly. "No, she needed me guilty first." Around them, laughter echoed softly through the penthouse, while snow buried Chicago outside in silence. Claire looked devastated. "My God." "Yeah. You have proof." Graham met her eyes calmly. "Yes." That single word changed everything, because Claire understood immediately what Graham intended. Not revenge. Exposure. And once truth entered a room like this, it spread faster than fire. Vanessa found him 20 minutes later near the private lounge corridor, her breathing already uneven. "What did you say to Claire Truth?" Panic flashed openly across her face for the first time in years. Real panic. Not curated emotion. "You promised me. I promised nothing." "Graham, please." That word stopped him cold. "Please?" Vanessa almost never pleaded. Not because she lacked emotion, because she hated surrender. "You don't understand what this could become," she whispered urgently. "I understand perfectly." "No, you don't." "Yes," he said quietly. "I finally do." Footsteps approached behind them. Adrian, of course. He looked between them, immediately reading the atmosphere with frightening intelligence. "What happened?" Graham turned toward him calmly. "You should ask Vanessa how many people she convinced I was unfaithful before anyone knew about you." Adrian's expression darkened instantly. "Not here. That seems to be your favorite phrase." Vanessa stepped closer desperately. "Graham, stop." But something irreversible had already begun. Across the ballroom, Claire spoke quietly with another guest. Then another. The movement spread subtly, like cracks beneath ice. Adrian noticed too. For the first time all evening, genuine fear entered his face. "You told people I corrected people." Vanessa looked like she might collapse. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. Graham stared at her in disbelief. Even now, her first instinct concerned narrative structure instead of destruction. "How exactly was it supposed to happen?" he asked softly. "Was I eventually meant to become the cheating husband publicly while you escaped quietly?" Tears filled her eyes immediately. "Please." "You photographed me." "Yes." "You spread rumors." "Yes." "You made me question my sanity for years while you were sleeping with him." Her composure finally shattered. "Because I was scared." The words cracked violently through the corridor, loud enough that nearby conversations began slowing. Several guests turned subtly toward them. Vanessa realized too late. Her breathing became erratic. "I was trying to survive," she whispered again, weaker this time. Adrian stepped forward sharply. "This conversation is over." Graham looked at him calmly. "No." Your affair is over. The silence afterward felt catastrophic, not loud, worse, contained. Because everyone nearby now understood enough to begin assembling the truth themselves. Vanessa covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Adrian's face hardened into cold fury, and Graham suddenly felt nothing. No triumph, no revenge, just exhaustion. 3 years of emotional warfare ending not with screaming, but with collapse. An hour later, the penthouse had begun emptying unnaturally early. Whispers moved faster than music. Vanessa disappeared without telling anyone. Graham found her upstairs in Adrian's private study overlooking the city. She stood near the windows barefoot, now heels abandoned and somewhere downstairs. Mascara streaked faintly beneath her eyes. For the first time since he met her 15 years ago, she looked completely unprotected. Not glamorous, not strategic, just broken. You shouldn't have come up here, she said quietly without turning around. I wanted to hear the truth once without performance. Vanessa laughed weakly through tears. I don't know if I remember how anymore. Graham closed the door behind him softly. The city glowed beneath them like frozen circuitry. When did you stop loving me? He asked. The question lingered painfully. Finally, Vanessa answered. I never stopped loving you. He looked at her sharply. Then why? She turned slowly, and the expression on her face devastated him more than anger could have. Because it wasn't cruelty. It was emptiness. I stopped loving honestly, she whispered. Silence filled the room. Vanessa wrapped both arms around herself tightly. When we first got married, I was terrified all the time. Tears slid quietly down her face. Terrified you'd realize I wasn't enough. Terrified you'd leave. Terrified someone smarter or softer or easier would eventually replace me. You should have told me that. I couldn't. She shook her head brokenly. Vulnerability felt humiliating. Graham said nothing, so she kept going. And after a while, her voice cracked. Control felt safer than honesty. The sentence hollowed the room. Vanessa wiped at her tears angrily. I learned how to manage people instead of trusting them, how to monitor love instead of feeling it. She looked at him directly now. Eventually, I stopped understanding relationships any other way. Power and fear, not intimacy, not trust, just emotional leverage disguised as devotion. You turned marriage into surveillance, Graham said quietly. Yes, you turned me into a suspect, yes. You made me feel guilty for existing around other women because you needed me afraid enough not to notice your own betrayal. Vanessa closed her eyes. Yes. The honesty landed heavier now than lies ever had, because at last she wasn't defending herself. She was finally seeing herself clearly, and maybe that hurt most of all. You know what's strange, she whispered after a long silence. What I think part of me wanted you to actually have the affair. Graham's chest tightened. Why? Because then all this would make sense. There it was, the final truth beneath everything. Vanessa had spent years trying to force external reality to match her internal fear. Not because she enjoyed destruction, because uncertainty was unbearable to her. If Graham betrayed her, then her paranoia became intuition. Her manipulation became justified. Her own affair became reaction instead of origin. She had been trying to emotionally reverse cause and effect, and somewhere along the way she destroyed both of them. Graham walked slowly toward the windows beside her. Snow continued falling endlessly over Chicago below. What happens now? Vanessa asked softly. For the first time in years, Graham answered without hesitation. We stop lying. Vanessa stared out at the city in silence. And though neither said the word aloud, both finally understood the same thing. Their marriage had ended long before tonight. Tonight was simply the moment the performance finally died too. The scandal did not explode. It unraveled. Quietly, elegantly, like expensive fabric tearing down the center seam. Within 48 hours of the Keller Gala, whispers moved through Chicago's upper social circles with surgical precision. No dramatic headlines appeared. No public accusations surfaced online. People like Adrian Keller did not collapse publicly. They dissolved privately first. Board members resigned for personal reasons. Foundation meetings were postponed indefinitely. Certain investors stopped returning calls. And Vanessa, once effortlessly welcomed into every charity luncheon, gallery opening, and donor event, began receiving fewer invitations with each passing day. Social exile in wealthy circles rarely announced itself directly. It arrived through absence. 3 weeks later, Graham stood alone inside the penthouse kitchen while movers carried boxes quietly through the apartment. Vanessa had agreed to leave, not because the divorce proceedings demanded it, because staying had become unbearable. The home no longer functioned as a shared reality. Every room contained echoes now. The dining table where accusations disguised themselves as concern. the hallway where she once searched his coat pockets after midnight. The bedroom where both of them spent years sleeping beside lies too exhausted to confront directly. Vanessa emerged from the office carrying a small storage box against her chest. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt hostile, just final. "I found these," she said softly. She handed him several old photographs. Napa Valley, their first apartment. A beach in Maine 15 years earlier. In every image, they looked unbearably young, not in age. In emotional innocence. Graham studied one photo longer than the others. Vanessa laughing into ocean wind while he held the camera crookedly. No suspicion yet. No manipulation. Just two people still believing love alone could protect them from themselves. "We were happy once," Vanessa whispered. He nodded slowly. Yes. The simplicity of the answer seemed to hurt her more than blame would have, because neither of them could deny it anymore. The tragedy wasn't that their marriage had always been broken. The tragedy was that it hadn't. Something real existed once, which made its destruction feel almost sacred in its sadness. Vanessa looked around the apartment one final time. Claire stopped speaking to me. Graham remained quiet. So did Nina. Again silence. Not punishment, just consequence. Vanessa swallowed hard. "I keep thinking someone's going to call and tell me this entire thing can still be fixed." Graham looked at her carefully, and a weak smile touched her mouth. "No one calls." Outside the windows, snow drifted across downtown Chicago in slow spirals. Winter had settled permanently now, cold enough to preserve damage. Adrian Keller disappeared from public view entirely by January. Rumors circulated about internal investigations connected to financial disclosures, though nothing criminal surfaced officially. Money insulated powerful men differently, but reputations still bled. Vanessa received one final message from him 3 days before Christmas. Graham accidentally saw it illuminated across the kitchen counter while she packed books into cardboard boxes. "We should stop contacting each other for a while. No affection, no apology, just risk management." Vanessa stared at the message for nearly a full minute before quietly deleting it. And somehow that moment hurt Graham more than discovering the affair itself. Because after all the secrecy, manipulation, and emotional destruction, the relationship at the center of it all ended not with passion, but administration. Elise remained distant intentionally, not cold, careful. After the gala, she and Graham spoke only about work for nearly 2 weeks. No late-night conversations, no emotional confessions. Both understood the danger now. Trauma created intimacy quickly, too quickly, and neither wanted to mistake emotional survival for love. Still, one evening after a client meeting, they found themselves walking together beside the Chicago River beneath fresh snowfall. The city glowed silver and blue around them. "You seem calmer," Elise observed gently. Graham shoved his hands into his coat pockets against the cold. "I think I'm finally hearing my own thoughts again." She nodded like someone who understood exactly what that meant. For several blocks, neither spoke. Then Elise glanced toward him carefully. "Do you hate her?" The question lingered in frozen air. Graham considered it honestly. "No," he said at last. Why not? Because hatred required certainty. And after years beside Vanessa, certainty itself felt fragile. "I think," he answered quietly. She spent so much time trying to control abandonment that she eventually created the thing she feared. Elise exhaled softly. "That's sad." "Yes. It's also not your responsibility anymore." The words settled deeply inside him. Not your responsibility anymore. For years, Graham had carried Vanessa's fear like unpaid emotional debt. Her suspicions became his burden to manage. Her insecurity became his behavior to correct. Her paranoia became his moral trial. Now, for the first time, he understood something liberating. Love could explain someone's damage without requiring you to survive inside it forever. At the corner light, Elise stopped walking. Snow gathered softly in her dark hair. "What happens with us?" she asked quietly. The honesty of the question deserved equal honesty in return. Graham looked at her for a long moment. "You were the first person who made me feel sane again." Emotion flickered across her face immediately. But I don't trust myself yet." Not because he feared loving her, because he feared needing her too quickly. Elise smiled sadly. "That's probably the healthiest thing you've said since I met you." He laughed softly. A real laugh this time. Small, but real. Then she stepped closer and kissed his cheek gently. Nothing more. No dramatic declaration, no desperate romance. Just warmth, human and careful. "I'll see you Monday," she said. And then she walked away into the falling snow. Graham watched her disappear slowly into the glowing city crowd. He did not follow. February arrived colder than expected. The divorce proceedings moved quietly, efficiently. Vanessa stopped contesting most things. The fight had left her. Sometimes Graham caught glimpses of her during final legal meetings and barely recognized the woman sitting across from him. Not because she looked older, because she no longer looked certain. One afternoon, after signing another stack of documents, Vanessa paused. Near the courthouse elevator, "I need to ask you something." Graham looked up. "Okay." She hesitated, then finally whispered the question that had probably haunted her for years. "Did you ever actually cheat on me?" The elevator hummed softly nearby. People moved around them unnoticed. Graham held her gaze steadily. "No." Vanessa's eyes closed briefly. Not relief, grief, because at last she understood the full weight of what she had done. All those years spent punishing betrayal that never existed, until her fear became the very thing that destroyed them both. "I don't know how to live without suspicion," she admitted quietly. The confession sounded less like manipulation now, more like mourning. Graham studied her tired face carefully. Then gently, honestly, he answered, "That's something no one else can fix for you." Vanessa nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, she did not argue. On the first Sunday morning of March, Graham walked alone through downtown Chicago beneath falling snow. The city was still half asleep. Coffee shops glowed warmly against gray streets, while wind pushed powdered snow across empty intersections. He crossed the river slowly, hands buried in his coat pockets. No phone calls, no accusations, no explanations waiting at home. For months after the collapse, silence had frightened him. Now it felt clean, not lonely, clear. He stopped halfway across the bridge, overlooking dark winter water moving beneath ice. And there, surrounded by cold air and the distant sound of traffic, Graham finally understood the deepest damage manipulation leaves behind. It wasn't heartbreak. It wasn't humiliation. It was self-distrust, the slow erosion of your own instincts, the terrible conditioning that makes you question harmless emotions, innocent interactions, even your own memories. Vanessa had not simply accused him of betrayal. She had taught him to monitor himself constantly through the lens of guilt. And surviving that required more than leaving her. It required learning to trust his own mind again. Snow collected quietly along the shoulders of his black coat. The city stretched endlessly ahead. For the first time in years, no one was watching him. No one was measuring his pauses or analyzing his tone or searching his face for hidden meaning. He was simply a man walking through winter alone, and strangely beautifully. That felt like freedom.